December 2002, Stamford, Lincolnshire. A furnace that had not gone cold in living memory is allowed, at last, to die. The last mold is poured. The iron sets. No ceremony is arranged. No one is asked to attend. 40 years earlier, this single site in a quiet English market town employed more than 1,000 people across a single shift. Engines built in these foundries powered irrigation pumps across the Middle East. It was said that a man could stand anywhere in rural Iraq, in the stillness of a desert night, and hear a Blackstone engine working somewhere in the dark. The company had existed for 165 years. It had survived 2 world wars, a global depression, and 4 successive corporate takeovers. What it could not survive was a decision made quietly in a boardroom in another country that it was no longer worth the cost of keeping open. How does a company that once powered 3 continents disappear without a monument, a ceremony, or a single plaque on the ground where it stood? The answer begins in 1837. A small workshop on a Lincolnshire street, a millwright with a piece of cast iron, and an ambition that would outlast him by 165 years. In the spring of 1837, a man named Henry Smith arrived in Stamford with a set of tools, a working knowledge of cast iron, and no particular reason to believe he was about to found anything lasting. Smith was a millwright by trade, a practical man from Kettering, trained in the repair and construction of machinery, accustomed to the grammar of iron and the economics of agricultural need. He set up a small workshop in Sheep Market, one of Stamford's older commercial streets, at a moment when the English countryside was caught between 2 worlds. The harvest was still brought in by hand, the fields still answered to the horse, but the factories of the North were already rewriting what manufacturing meant, and the farmers of the Midlands and the Fens were beginning to understand that the man who could machine a better tool would eat before the man who could not. Smith understood this precisely. His first products were simple: cast iron implements for the farm, rakes, rollers, cutters designed for the specific demands of Lincolnshire agriculture. Among them, a horse rake that proved immediately and unexpectedly popular. It was not a glamorous invention. It gathered cut grass from a field and deposited it into rows for collection. It did this reliably, required relatively little maintenance, and could be repaired by any competent blacksmith. In the language of Victorian commerce, it's sold, and when a product sells, a workshop becomes a business. By the early 1840s, Smith had taken on a partner. Thomas Woodhouse Ashby joined the firm, and the business was renamed Smith & Ashby, the first of several identities it would wear over the following 4 decades. The firm grew steadily through the 1840s and 1850s, expanding its range of implements and its reputation across the county. When Smith retired in 1857, Ashby continued under his own name, and the workforce had grown to somewhere in the region of 150 men, a substantial employer for a market town of Stamford's size. The partners who followed left their names on the business in succession: Ashby and Jeffrey, then Ashby, Jeffrey and Luke, the Rutland Iron Works operating from its original site, producing the reliable, unspectacular machinery that kept English farming moving through the long, mid-Victorian decades. None of these men were visionaries. That is not a criticism. The business they maintained required consistency, not inspiration, the ability to read what farmers needed, to price it correctly, and to deliver it without disaster. They did this competently for 30 years, and the firm survived them all. What the business lacked by the mid-1870s was momentum. The agricultural machinery market was changing. Steam power was beginning to assert itself on larger farms. Competitors in Birmingham and Sheffield were investing in new processes. The Rutland Iron Works remained profitable, but it was no longer growing, and a business that does not grow in a market that is moving is a business that is beginning to fall behind. The transformation, when it came, arrived in the form of a single new partner. In 1877, a 30-year-old engineer named Edward Christopher Blackstone was admitted to the firm, then operating under the name of Ashby, Jeffrey and Luke. The arrangement was formalized as Jeffrey and Blackstone. It was, to outward appearances, a routine change of partnership, the sort of legal adjustment that happened in small manufacturing firms across England every week. No one outside Stamford took particular notice. The Lincolnshire papers did not mark the occasion. They had no reason to. At the time of his admission, Blackstone was simply a young man with engineering training and enough capital to buy into a going concern. What he brought with him, beyond the money, was less easy to quantify, a quality of attention to mechanical possibility that would, over the following 2 decades, redirect the entire purpose of the firm he had just joined. But that was still in the future. In 1877, the Rutland Iron Works made farm implements. A horse rake had started it. A new partner would change everything. The question was what he would change it into. Edward Blackstone did not move quickly. That, in retrospect, is part of what made him effective. In the 5 years that followed his admission to the firm, he worked within the existing structure, learning the site, understanding the workforce, building the trust that precedes influence. When George Jeffrey finally sold his interest in 1882, Blackstone was ready. He bought out his partner's share, brought in George Mills, a member of his wife's family, a man he could rely upon, and assumed full direction of the business. The firm was his. What he inherited was sound but static, a competent ironworks producing agricultural implements for a regional market, operating from a site on Rutland Terrace that had served the business adequately for 40 years. Adequately was no longer enough. Blackstone understood, with the clarity of a man who had spent 5 years watching a business from the inside, that the Rutland Iron Works needed two things: more space and a different product. The space came first. In 1886, the company relocated to a new and substantially larger site off Ryhall Road, on the eastern edge of Stamford. The move was significant, not merely logistical, but declaratory. A business that outgrows its premises is a business that intends to produce more than it currently does. The Ryhall Road site gave Blackstone room to think at scale. 3 years later, on the 29th of January, 1889, the legal architecture of the enterprise was formalized. Blackstone & Co. Limited was incorporated, a limited liability company with Edward Blackstone as chairman and a board that included Mills, Thomas Philip Blythe, William Widger Blackstone, and George Hunt. The name that had belonged to a single man was now the name of an institution. It would remain so for the next 80 years. The product took longer to find. It arrived, as transformative things sometimes do, from an unexpected direction, and in the persons of two brothers from Sussex. Frank Carter and his brother Evershed, known to his family as Todd, had been working in Billingshurst on an engine of their own design. They called it the Reliance, a hot bulb oil engine running on lamp oil rather than coal or steam, capable of sustained mechanical work without the infrastructure that steam power demanded. By 1894, they had developed it to a point where it functioned reliably. What they lacked was the manufacturing capacity to produce it at volume. Blackstone had that capacity. In 1895, the Carter brothers joined the company. In 1896, Blackstone & Co. began producing the Reliance engine under license, the first internal combustion engine to carry the Blackstone name. It was a pivot that would define the company for the next century. The decision to manufacture the Reliance was not in itself a gamble. Oil engines were already an established technology, and the agricultural market had a clear and growing appetite for portable, reliable power that did not require a boiler, a water supply, and a trained stoker. What Blackstone understood, and what the Carter brothers provided, was that the specific design of the Reliance gave it a practical advantage over competitors. It was straightforward to operate, economical to run, and robust enough to work in the conditions that farming actually imposed on machinery. Frank Carter became works manager in 1904. He was, by the accounts of those who worked under him, a man of formidable concentration, the sort of engineer who woke in the night with a solution to a problem he had not yet consciously solved and was at the works before dawn to test it. His daughter Mary, speaking of him decades later, would recall him rising from bed in the small hours, dressing quickly, and walking to Ryall Road, because an idea had come to him that could not wait for morning. Between Edward Blackstone and the two Carter brothers, the pace of innovation was relentless. New designs were tested, refined, and protected. Between them, Blackstone and the Carters jointly registered 64 British patents, a figure that reflects not occasional inspiration, but sustained, methodical invention. Each patent was a specific solution to a specific engineering problem: a fuel system, a valve arrangement, a method of starting, a modification to the combustion cycle. Taken together, they represent one of the most productive engineering partnerships in the history of English manufacturing. By 1912, the company had developed a new internal combustion engine that ran on vaporizing oil and ignited by an electrical spark, an advance that rendered the hot bulb mechanism obsolete and positioned Blackstone at the forward edge of engine technology. By 1919, they had mounted a three-cylinder, 25-horsepower version into a crawler tractor, which remained in production until 1925. The workshop that Henry Smith had opened in the sheep market in 1837 with a horse rake in a regional market had become, within the space of a single generation, a company manufacturing advanced internal combustion engines for customers it had not yet imagined, in countries it had not yet reached. What those countries would become, and how many of them would come to depend on what Rye Hall Road produced, was already beginning to take shape. The world beyond Lincolnshire was opening to the engine. And the engine, it turned out, was exactly what the world needed. There is a particular quality to a factory at full production. Not merely the noise, though the noise at Blackstone Works by the early years of the 20th century was considerable, a layered roar of casting, machining, and assembly that could be heard from the far end of Ryall Road. But the sense of organized human energy moving in a single direction, every process feeding the next, the whole mechanism of the place oriented toward a single outcome: an engine, tested, crated, shipped. By the first decade of the 20th century, Blackstone & Co. had found its market, and the market was larger than Stamford had ever imagined. The transition from agricultural implements to oil engines had not displaced the company's core customer, the farmer, the estate manager, the man who needed reliable mechanical power in a location without mains electricity or a steam infrastructure. What it had done was expand the geography of that customer beyond all previous limits. A horse rake was a local product, sold at county shows, delivered by cart to farms within a reasonable radius of Lincolnshire. An oil engine was a different proposition entirely. It could be crated and placed on a railway wagon. It could be shipped from a port. It could arrive weeks later in a warehouse in Cairo, a depot in Karachi, a merchant's yard in Basra. And when it was uncrated and set running, it would perform exactly as it had performed on the test floor in Stamford. This was the commercial logic that made Blackstone an international company. The engine did not care where it ran, and the world, it turned out, had a vast and urgent appetite for reliable mechanical power. The Middle East became the company's most consequential export market. Across Iraq and Iran, Blackstone engines were installed in irrigation systems that transformed the agricultural output of river valleys that had farmed the same way for centuries. The engines pumped water, the water fed fields, the fields fed populations. It was not a small thing that was happening in those installations. It was, in the specific and practical sense, the difference between sufficiency and want for communities that had no other means of lifting water in the volumes that modern agriculture required. The engines ran continuously, day and night, across seasons and years. They were maintained by local operators who learned their mechanics out of necessity and came, in time, to understand them thoroughly. The reputation they built was not the reputation of advertising copy. It was the reputation of a machine that started when it was asked to start and kept running when it was needed to keep running. It was said among those who knew the region that a man could stand anywhere in rural Iraq or Iran in the stillness of a desert night and hear a Blackstone engine working somewhere in the dark. The claim was not precise. It was the kind of thing that accumulates around a product when its presence becomes unremarkable, when it is simply there, as furniture is simply there, as a tool that has become so embedded in a place that to remove it would be to alter the place itself. In Stamford, the consequences of this reach were visible and direct. Between 1877, when Edward Blackstone joined the firm, and 1914, the workforce had grown from approximately 100 men to more than 1,000. The Rye Hall Road site, which had seemed generously proportioned when the company moved there in 1886, had expanded outward to fill and then exceed its original footprint. New buildings had been added, erecting shops, test rooms, drawing offices, a foundry capable of casting engine components at a scale the original Rutland Ironworks could not have contemplated. The Stamford East Railway Station, which sat adjacent to the works, had become a logistical artery. Raw materials in, finished engines out. The railway connecting Blackstone to the ports, and from the ports to the world. The workforce that filled this site was, in the way of all manufacturing towns, the social fabric of the place it occupied. Fathers brought sons, brothers worked adjacent benches. The company was considered, by those who knew the landscape of British engineering apprenticeships, to be among the finest training grounds in the country, mentioned in the same breath as Peter Brotherhood and Baker Perkins in nearby Peterborough. A Blackstone apprenticeship meant something. It meant a standard of precision, a discipline of process, a familiarity with machinery that was portable and valued wherever engines were made or maintained. The peak of this employment, more than 1,200 men on the Stamford site alone, would not be reached until 1960, when the company had been through 2 world wars, a depression, and its first corporate acquisition, and was still producing engines that engineers in 3 continents regarded as among the most reliable in their class. That number, 1,200, represents not merely a head count, but a geometry of dependency. 1,200 wages, 1,200 households, 1,200 sets of school fees, and grocery bills and rent payments flowing through the economy of a single Lincolnshire market town from a single gate on Rye Hall Road. It was by any measure an empire, a quiet one. Stamford is not Bradford or Birmingham. It does not carry the mythology of the great industrial cities, but an empire nonetheless, built on the specific excellence of a thing that worked in a world that needed things to work. The engines ran, the orders came, the railway moved the crates, and somewhere in the dark, above a river valley in a country most of the men on the shop floor had never visited and could not have found on a map, a Blackstone engine turned and turned and turned. It could not last, of course. Nothing built on this scale, in this world, ever does. In August 1914, the orders changed. The order, when it came, was not a request. In the late summer of 1914, the British government began the process of converting civilian manufacturing capacity to war production, a process that would accelerate dramatically over the following 2 years as the scale of what was happening in northern France became impossible to understate. Factories that made furniture were asked to make rifle stocks. Mills that wove cotton were redirected to khaki. And an engine works in Stamford, Lincolnshire, whose product had spent the last 2 decades irrigating the fields of the Middle East and powering the farms of England, was asked to make shell cases. The machinery was different. The tolerances were different. The material flowing through the foundry and the machine shop was being shaped not into something that would sustain life, not into a pump or a tractor or an engine that would lift water from a river onto a dry field, but into the outer casing of an artillery shell, a cylinder of steel that existed for the single purpose of containing an explosive charge until the moment of detonation. Blackstone & Co. made the adjustment because it had no alternative, and because the men who ran it understood, as most people in Britain understood in 1914, that the war would require everything that the country could produce. What followed was a transformation of the site that those who had worked there before the war would have found in some particulars almost unrecognizable. The erecting shops that had assembled oil engines in various stages of completion, the organized landscape of castings, crankshafts, fuel systems, and test beds were reconfigured for munitions work. The production rhythms changed. The output was measured not in engines dispatched to export markets, but in shell cases completed and collected, counted by government inspectors, loaded onto the Stamford East Railway, and moved toward the coast. And then there were the women. The departure of men to the front lines created a labor shortage that the war industries could not absorb without a fundamental change in who was permitted to work on the factory floor. At Blackstone Works, as at manufacturing sites across Britain, women entered the workforce in substantial numbers for the first time, operating lathes, checking tolerances, working the production lines that the men beside them had vacated. The photographs that survive from this period show them standing at their stations with the particular composed attention of people who have learned something new and are concentrating on doing it correctly. A row of women in overalls, flanking the shell cases they have produced, the cases stacked in ordered columns behind them, taller than the women themselves. There is something in those photographs that resists easy interpretation. These are women doing essential and skilled work in conditions that were loud, physically demanding, and in the handling of munitions components. Not without danger. They are doing it competently. The shells they made were used in a war that killed millions of men, on battlefields that erased entire landscapes, in engagements whose consequences their country would spend the rest of the century absorbing. The photograph does not contain any of that. It contains only the women and the cases in a factory in Lincolnshire on an ordinary working day. The ordinary working day was what the war required, and so Blackstone provided it. Edward Christopher Blackstone died in 1916. He was 66 years old. He had spent 39 years building the company that bore his name, from a junior partner in a flagging agricultural ironworks to the chairman of a limited company with a global export market and 64 registered patents. He had overseen the move to Rye Hall Road, the incorporation of 1889, the arrival of the Carter brothers, the pivot from farm implements to oil engines. He had watched his product travel to places he had never been and do work that he had never imagined when he and George Jeffrey had first formalized their arrangement in 1877. He died while his factory was making shell cases. That conjunction, the man who built engines to irrigate deserts, dying in the year his works turned to the manufacture of weapons, is not a neat irony. It is simply what happened. But it has the quality in retrospect of a hinge. The point at which the world that Blackstone had built his company to serve had been replaced, temporarily but completely, by a world that required something else entirely from the same buildings, the same lathes, the same furnaces. Frank Carter remained. He was at the works every day as he had been since 1896, managing production, maintaining standards, solving the problems that arose when a site optimized for engines was made to produce munitions instead. He would continue to do so until long after the war ended and the shell cases stopped coming and the orders for oil engines began again. Slowly at first, and then with an urgency that would carry the company into its most expansive and confident decade. But Edward Blackstone was gone. His name stayed above the gate. His patents remained in force. His decisions, the site, the incorporation, the Carter invitation, the oil engine pivot, were the structural decisions on which everything that followed was built. The man had gone. The machine ran on. The years between the Armistice and the Depression were, for Blackstone and Co., years of reconstruction and confidence. The shell cases stopped. The munitions contracts were wound down. The Rye Hall Road site was reconfigured, once again, for the work it had been built to do. The erecting shops returned to engines. The test beds resumed their rhythm. The export orders, which had been suspended for the duration, began to arrive again. From the Middle East, from the colonies, from agricultural markets across 3 continents that had been waiting, with varying degrees of patience, for the machinery they had ordered before the world interrupted itself. Frank Carter was at the center of all of it. He had managed the wartime conversion. He managed the reconversion. He was, by the early 1920s, the operational mind of the company in a way that no single figure had been since Edward Blackstone himself. The man who knew where every process lived, who understood the tolerances of every machine on the floor, who could identify a problem in a running engine by the quality of its sound before any instrument confirmed it. His working method had not changed since Mary Carter had watched him leave the house in the small hours. The idea came, and he went to test it, regardless of the hour. The company he helped run through the 1920s was, by most measures, thriving. New engine designs entered production. The product range expanded. Blackstone's reputation in export markets, built on 2 decades of reliable performance in conditions that tested machinery severely, continued to attract orders that smaller or less established manufacturers could not compete for. The works were busy, Stamford was employed, but the structure in which Blackstone operated had grown more complicated. In the late 1920s, the company had become part of the Agricultural and General Engineers Group. Age. a conglomerate that had consolidated a number of British agricultural and engineering manufacturers under a single commercial umbrella. The logic was familiar. Collective purchasing power, shared distribution networks, the economies that come from scale. Blackstone continued to operate from Stamford, continued to manufacture under its own name, continued to sell to its own markets. The age arrangement was, for most practical purposes, invisible to the men on the Ryle Road shop floor. In 1929, Blackstone was building diesel engines for Age's wider product range, a further evolution of the engineering capability that the company had been developing since the Reliance engine first ran in 1896. The diesel work was technically demanding and commercially promising. It extended Blackstone's reach into power applications that oil engines could not serve, and it positioned the company at the edge of what British engine manufacturing could do. Then in 1932, Age collapsed. The mechanism of the collapse was the mechanism of the Depression. Over-leveraged, undercapitalized, caught between falling demand and the fixed costs of a large industrial organization. Age as a corporate entity ceased to function. The companies it had consolidated scattered, some into administration, some into the hands of receivers, some absorbed by competitors who moved quickly into the wreckage. Blackstone & Co. survived. It was one of the very few Age constituent companies that emerged from the collapse as a functioning business, a fact that speaks directly to the quality of what it made and the depth of the markets it had built. An engine with the reputation of a Blackstone did not lose its customers because its parent company had been mismanaged. The customers still needed the engine. The engine still existed. The Rye Road works still stood, still employed its men, still had the tooling and the knowledge to produce what the world continued to order. But the survival had a cost that was not immediately visible in the balance sheet. Frank Carter died in 1934. He had been works manager since 1904. 30 years at the operational center of everything Blackstone made, every patent it registered, every engine it tested and shipped. He died in post, which is to say he died doing the work, which is the only way a man of his particular formation could have ended. There was no retirement, no ceremonial departure, no farewell address. He was there, and then he was not, and the gap he left was the kind that cannot be filled by a replacement, only worked around carefully by people who understood what had been lost. 2 years later, in 1936, R.A. Lister and Company of Dursley, Gloucestershire, acquired Blackstone & Co. The transaction was completed in 1937, forming the entity that would trade as Lister Blackstone. Lister was itself a substantial manufacturer, agricultural machinery, engines, generating sets, and its interest in Blackstone was specific: access to the larger engine market that Blackstone's designs and reputation commanded. The acquisition was not a rescue. Blackstone was not failing. It was rather an absorption, a decision made at the level of commercial strategy that the railroad workforce had no part in and no vote on. The name above the gate changed. Blackstone remained, but it was now a suffix, the second half of another company's identity. Edward Blackstone had been dead for 18 years, Frank Carter for 2. The men who had built the thing were gone. What remained was the thing itself: the site, the machines, the knowledge, the reputation, the engines still running in 3 continents. And elsewhere in Europe, in the autumn of 1936, other things were also in motion. Things that would, within 3 years, reach through the gates of Ryle Road once more and ask the works to change itself again. The letter, when it arrived, was different from the one in 1914. In 1914, the conversion of civilian manufacturing to war production had been improvised. A vast, urgent, sometimes chaotic process of adaptation. As a country that had not fought a continental war in a century tried to understand what fighting one actually required. By 1939, there was no such uncertainty. The government had been planning the industrial mobilization for years. The ministries knew which factories existed, what they could produce, what their capacities were, and what modifications would be necessary to redirect them toward the specific outputs that a modern mechanized war would demand. When the letter came to Ryle Road in the autumn of 1939, It came with a clarity that 1914 had not possessed. Lister Blackstone, as the company was now formally known, was told what it would make. The decision was not negotiated. The product range was restructured with a directness that left no ambiguity about priorities. All production of open-crank spring injection engines was stopped. The small vertical engines, petrol, kerosene, diesel, that had served the civilian and agricultural markets for decades were stood down. The automotive engines that had been under development were suspended. The commercial order book, with its export commitments and its long-standing customer relationships, was set aside for the duration. What replaced it was a single, concentrated focus: the EPV engine, a power unit designed for baseload generation, capable of running continuously under sustained demand, required in large numbers by all three of the armed services simultaneously. The Army needed generating sets for field operations, mobile power for communications equipment, for field hospitals, for the logistical infrastructure that a mechanized army trails behind it like a second body. The Navy needed auxiliary power for vessels whose primary engines could not be run continuously in harbor or at anchor. The RAF needed ground power for airfields, for the lighting, the communications, the maintenance equipment that kept aircraft operational between sorties. Each service had its own specifications, its own delivery schedules, its own inspection requirements. Lister Blackstone was expected to meet all of them. The Rye Hall Road works ran accordingly. The shift patterns extended. The site operated through hours it had not previously worked, the furnaces drawing heat through the night, the machine shop active before dawn, the test beds running engines through their cycles in a continuous loop of production and verification. The women who had entered the workforce during the First World War had largely left it when the men returned in 1918. They returned now, in 1939 and 1940, to the same lathes and the same tolerances, to work that had not changed in its fundamental demands, even as the product had changed entirely. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from doing essential work in conditions of emergency, year after year, with no clear end in sight. The men and women of the Rye Hall Road Works experienced it in the way that all British manufacturing workers experienced it between 1940 and 1945, not dramatically, not in the manner of the frontline accounts that fill the histories of the war, but steadily, quietly, in the accumulation of long shifts and rationed food, and the specific anxiety of knowing that what they made was needed, and that the need would not pause for their fatigue. The engines they produced went to places whose names they heard on the wireless and read in the newspapers: North Africa, the Atlantic convoys, the airfields of southern England from which the Battle of Britain was fought. The connection between a generating set assembled on a shop floor in Lincolnshire and the outcome of an engagement in a desert or an ocean was not direct, not legible in any single event. It was systemic, the kind of contribution that holds a structure together without being visible in the structure itself, the way a foundation is invisible in a building that stands. Lister Blackstone delivered. The records show no significant failures of supply, no major interruptions to the EPV production program, no moment at which the Stamford works fell materially short of what was asked of it. This was not a small achievement for a company that had spent the previous 3 years absorbing a corporate acquisition, losing its most experienced works manager, and restructuring its product range for civilian demand. It was, in the plain language of what it cost, in labor, in material, in the sustained attention of everyone on the site, a considerable one. When the war ended in 1945, the Rye Hall Road Works was intact. The building stood. The machinery was serviceable. The workforce, depleted in some areas and reconfigured in others, remained. The knowledge that made Blackstone engines what they were, the accumulated precision of 100 years of engineering practice, had not been lost. But the company that re-emerged from the war was not the company that had entered it. Lister Blackstone was now a different entity from the one that had existed in 1936. Larger in some respects, more deeply integrated into the structures of British industrial organization. More visible to the institutions that would, in the coming decades, decide which companies were worth preserving and which were worth consolidating into something else. Those decisions were coming. It would take 20 years for the first of them to arrive at Rye Hall Road. When it did, it would arrive not as a crisis, but as a signature on a document in a room that none of the men on the shop floor would ever enter. The first document arrived on the 1st of June 1965. It was not a crisis that delivered it. There were no unpaid wages, no failed contracts, no creditors at the gate. Lister Blackstone was, by the standards of British engineering in the mid-1960s, a functioning and profitable enterprise. Its engines were still regarded, in the markets that knew them, as among the most reliable in their class. The Rye Hall Road works still employed hundreds of men and women. The name Blackstone still meant something to the engineers and purchasing managers of irrigation authorities, generating companies, and marine operators across 3 continents. None of that protected it from what came next. On the 1st of June 1965, Lister Blackstone was acquired by the Hawker Siddeley Group, a British industrial conglomerate that had grown through the post-war decades into one of the largest manufacturing organizations in the country, with interests spanning aerospace, electrical engineering, and heavy industry. The acquisition was, from Hawker Siddeley's perspective, a straightforward consolidation of assets. From the perspective of the men on the Rye Hall Road shop floor, it was the moment at which the company they worked for ceased, in any meaningful sense, to belong to the world they inhabited. Lister Blackstone had been a family business, not in the sentimental sense, but in the structural one. It had been run by people who knew what an engine was, who understood the specific demands of the markets it served, who walked the same floors as the men who made it. The Hawker Siddeley Group was run by people who understood portfolios. That is not a condemnation. It is a description of a difference that would, over the following 4 decades, determine the fate of Blackstone Works as completely as any engineering decision ever had. 4 years after the Hawker Siddeley acquisition, a further reorganization arrived. On the 1st of June 1969, Lister Blackstone's engine manufacturing operations were merged with those of Mirrlees National Limited, formerly Mirrlees Bickerton and Day, a Stockport-based engine manufacturer that Hawker Siddeley also controlled. The merged entity was named Mirrlees Blackstone Limited. The Blackstone name survived the merger, but it survived as a suffix, appended to a company based partly in Stockport. Managed from a distance, its Stamford operations, one division among several in an organization whose center of gravity was elsewhere. The engines continued. That must be said plainly. The engineering at Rye Hall Road did not stop, and it did not collapse into mediocrity simply because the ownership structure had changed. Blackstone engineers in the late 1960s and 1970s were still producing designs of genuine quality, engines that competed in international markets, that met the specifications of demanding customers, that carried forward the technical tradition that Frank Carter and Edward Blackstone had established 70 years earlier. But there were failures. Some of them were public, and they were damaging. British Rail in the 1960s and 1970s was in the process of replacing its aging diesel locomotive fleet, and Mirrlees Blackstone engines were supplied for a number of applications in which they did not perform as required. The Class 10 diesel shunters, fitted with Blackstone ER6T engines in place of the English electric units used in the far more numerous Class 08, were withdrawn early. A small fleet quickly retired, a footnote in the records of British locomotive development, but a visible one. More significantly, in the 1980s, 4 high-speed train power cars, the celebrated intercity 125 sets, whose Paxman Valenta engines had proved themselves in daily service, were re-engined with Mirrlees Blackstone MB 190 units for trials. The trials were unsuccessful. The MB 190 engines were removed. The Valenta units were reinstalled. The episode was noted, reported, and remembered by the engineering press in the way that public failures always are, more durably than the successes that surrounded them. These were setbacks, not catastrophes, but they accumulated in the ledger that large industrial organizations keep. The ledger in which products are assessed not merely on their merits, but on their commercial trajectory, their market position, their return relative to the capital they consume. By the late 1980s, that ledger was being read by people whose primary concern was not the engineering tradition of a Lincolnshire engine works. In 1988, General Electric Company plc, the British GEC, distinct from the American corporation of the same name, merged its diesel engine businesses, including Mirrlees Blackstone, with the Alstom division of the French Compagnie Générale d'Électricité. The resulting entity, GEC Alstom, was a European industrial giant with operations across power generation, rail traction, and marine propulsion. Within it, Blackstone Works was one site among dozens, its output one product line among hundreds, its workforce one headcount in a spreadsheet that ran to thousands of rows. 12 years later, in February 2000, Alstom, as GEC Alstom had by then been renamed, following further corporate reorganization, sold its diesel engine operations to MAN B&W Diesel AG, a German engineering company. The sale price was not disclosed. The transaction was completed in June of that year. A company whose engines had once been heard in the night above the river valleys of Iraq was now a subsidiary of a German corporation. Managed from Augsburg, its future determined by people whose primary language was not English and whose reference point for Blackstone Works was a line in an acquisition document rather than a memory of the Rahal Road gate. The decision, when it came, took almost no time to make and was entirely logical by the standards of the framework in which it was made. The Stamford facility would close. The date set was the end of 2002. On Rahal Road, in the autumn of that year, the men and women who had spent their working lives inside those gates began the specific, quiet process of understanding that the thing they had given their years to was going to end. Not in a fire, not in a strike, not in a failure of the product they made, in a spreadsheet, in a decision, in a signature, in a room in another country that none of them had been asked to enter. The demolition crews arrived in the months that followed the closure, and they did their work with the efficiency that demolition always brings to the places that manufacture could not save. The buildings that had stood on the Rahal Road site since the 1880s, the erecting shop, the foundry, the test rooms, the drawing offices, the accumulated physical architecture of a company that had grown and contracted and grown again across 115 years on the same ground, came down in sections in the methodical sequence that structural engineers prescribe when a site must be cleared without disturbing what surrounds it. The iron columns went, the roof lights went, the concrete floor, with its pale rectangles and its century of embedded memory, was broken up and removed. The Stamford East Railway connection, which had carried raw materials in and finished engines out since the Victorian era, had already ceased to function as a working artery long before the demolition began. By the time the last wall came down, what had been the Rutland Engineering Works was a level site, cleared and measured and ready for the drawings that already existed for it. The retail park that replaced it was completed in stages over the following years. It was, and this must be said without particular animus, because it is simply a description, entirely ordinary. A supermarket, chain restaurants, a car park of the scale that chain restaurants and supermarkets require, access roads designed for the turning circles of delivery vehicles, the landscaping that planning authorities request as a condition of approval, the low shrubs and ornamental grasses that suggest greenery without suggesting anything else. People came to it because it was convenient, because it provided the goods and services that a market town of Stamford's size required, because it was there. They parked their cars and bought what they needed and left. None of them, or very few of them, had any reason to know what the ground beneath them had once contained. There was, for many years, no marker of any kind on the site itself. 165 years of manufacturing history occupied the land beneath the car park without acknowledgement, without a stone, a plaque, a panel, or a name. The Blackstone story was present in the town in other ways, held in archive collections at Lincolnshire County Council, in the memories of the men and women who had worked there, in the occasional engine that appeared at a country show or a museum display and attracted the attention of people who still knew what they were looking at. But on the ground where it had happened, there was nothing. In September 2025, the Stamford Civic Society unveiled a blue plaque. It was fixed not to the retail park. There is no surface on a retail park suitable for a blue plaque, and no institution willing to affix one, but to the Art Deco exterior of a building on Broad Street, the former Central Cinema, which stands on the site of the Blackstone & Co. Town Center showroom and warehouse built in 1913. The plaque commemorates three names: Edward Blackstone, Frank Carter, and Evershed Carter. It was funded by members of the Carter family and by a donation from Blackstone Sports and Social Club. The Civic Society had erected just 5 such plaques in the preceding 15 years. This was the 6th. The initiative had come from Linda Ball, Paul Johnson, and Maggie Portes, grandchildren of Frank Carter, the works manager who had died at his post in 1934 after 30 years on the Ryall Road floor. They had wondered for years why the contribution of the company and its founders had not been formally recognized. The plaque was their answer to that question. It is a modest answer, as blue plaques always are. A circle of painted metal on a wall, a name, a date, a line of description. But it is the only permanent public marker that the Blackstone story currently possesses in the town it defined for the better part of 2 centuries. Elsewhere, the engines speak for themselves, to those who know the language. At the Anson Engine Museum near Manchester, a collection of Blackstone engines is maintained in working order. Oil engines of various ages and configurations, the product of different decades of the Ryall Road works, each one a specific technical object that encodes within its castings and its machine surfaces the engineering knowledge of the people who designed and built it. On running days, these engines are started and allowed to run, and the sound they make is the sound of the thing itself. Not a recording, not a simulation, not a description, but the actual mechanical event, the combustion and the rotation and the specific acoustic signature of a Blackstone engine under load. People come to hear it. Some of them are engineers who understand what they are hearing. Some of them are simply people who wanted to know what it sounded like. The thing that once ran in the dark above the river valleys of Iraq and Iran, on a summer night when the irrigation channels were full and the crops were drinking. And then there is the football club. Blackstone's FC plays its home matches at the ground on Lincoln Road that the Rutland Engineering Works purchased in 1920, a site that initially comprised 2 football pitches and a cricket square, acquired by the company as a recreational facility for its workforce. The company is gone. The ground remains. The club that plays on it adopted its current name in 1998 when Mirrlees Blackstone closed its Stamford operations. A gesture of continuity in the face of ending, the name preserved in a context that the original bearers of it could not have anticipated. The club competes in the United Counties League. Its supporters stand on a ground that Blackstone workers built for Blackstone workers to use on their days away from the works. The works is gone. The ground is still there. The game goes on. It is the kind of survival that history occasionally produces. Not the monument, not the museum, not the Heritage Center with its interpretation panels and its gift shop, but the unplanned lateral persistence of a name in a context that simply refused to let it go. Blackstone's FC did not set out to be a memorial. It set out to play football. The memorial is incidental, which is perhaps why it works, in a way that a plaque on a retail park wall would not. The site on Ryall Road does not remember. Sites do not remember. The retail park receives its customers and processes their transactions and closes at the hours that retail parks close, indifferent to the century and a half of heat and noise and human effort that preceded it on the same ground. That indifference is not a moral failing. It is simply the nature of ground. The memory where it survives, survives in people. In the grandchildren of Frank Carter, who funded a plaque. In the volunteers at the Anson Engine Museum, who keep the engines running. In the men and women who worked at Ryall Road and carry the knowledge of what it was in the specific, irreplaceable way that only direct experience produces. They are not getting younger. There is a question that the history of Blackstone Works does not answer, because it is not the kind of question that history answers. It sits at the end of the story the way certain questions sit at the end of certain lives. Not demanding resolution, but demanding that it be asked, clearly and without evasion, before the account is closed. The question is this: when a company that sustained a town for 165 years is sold 4 times to 4 successive owners, each of whom valued it for something other than what it was, when the name above the gate changes from Blackstone to Lister Blackstone, to Mirrlees Blackstone, to GEC Alstom, to Mann B&W, each change a further dilution of the specific identity that the name had once contained, At what point does the thing itself end? Not the legal entity, not the asset register, not the brand. The thing. The company that Edward Blackstone, in the Carter brothers, built through 64 patents and 30 years of foundry work, and the specific accumulated knowledge of a workforce that learned its trade on the same floor where its fathers had learned theirs. It is tempting to say it ended in December 2002, when the gate closed and the furnace went cold. That is when the physical operation ceased, but the erosion had been proceeding for decades before that. In the boardrooms of Hawker Siddeley, in the merger documents of 1969, in the GEC Alstom restructuring of 1988, in the Alstom sale of 2000. The closure was not an event that happened to a living company. It was the administrative conclusion of a process that had been underway since the 1st of June 1965, when the company passed from the hands of people who understood what it was into the hands of people who understood what it was worth. Those are not the same thing. Under the MAN Diesel and Turbo brand, the corporate successor to the succession of corporate successors, spares and servicing for Lister Blackstone engines are still available. The knowledge that makes those engines serviceable still exists, held now in technical manuals and parts catalogs, rather than in the hands of the men who machined the components originally. The aftermarket persists. It will persist for as long as the engines themselves persist, and Blackstone engines were built to persist. Somewhere, in an irrigation installation in a country that no longer appears on the maps that existed when the engine was manufactured, in a generating set in a building whose original purpose has long since changed. A Blackstone engine is probably still running. It runs because it was made correctly, by people who were trained to make things correctly, in a works that held correctness as its fundamental standard across 165 years of continuous operation. Man does not advertise this particularly. There is no campaign built around the heritage of the Stamford works, no corporate narrative that reaches back to Henry Smith's workshop and sheep market and traces the line forward to the present. The heritage exists in the product, not in the marketing. The engines carry it without being asked to. What Stamford carries is harder to quantify. A market town of its size are beautiful, historically coherent, its limestone streets attracting tourists who come for the Georgian architecture and the river and the sense of a place that has kept its character across the centuries, does not obviously announce itself as an industrial city. The Blackstone story sits awkwardly in the Stamford narrative, which tends toward the aesthetic rather than the mechanical. The works are gone. The workers who remember them are aging. The blue plaque on Broad Street tells a name and a date to people passing on their way to somewhere else. And yet the question remains, and it is worth sitting with rather than answering too quickly. What is owed to a place by the companies that prosper within it? What is owed to a workforce by the institutions that acquire the companies those workers built? When the decision to close is made in Augsburg or Paris or wherever the next boardroom is located, and the decision is logical by the standards of the framework in which it is made, what standards should we apply to the framework itself? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the questions that Stamford asked in December 2002, and that dozens of other English towns had asked before it, and that others will ask again, as the logic of consolidation continues to work its way through the industrial inheritance that the Victorian age produced and the 20th century consumed. Blackstone & Co. made engines that worked. That is the simplest and most durable thing that can be said about it. In the quietness of a desert night, above a river valley in the dark, the engine turned. It did what it was made to do, in conditions that demanded reliability for longer than anyone had a right to expect. The men who built it are gone. The works that made it is gone. The engine turns. That is not a conclusion. It is an observation. The difference matters.